Hey friends, I recently had someone ask me about using storytelling to share the gospel with their friends and neighbors, and I was intrigued by that. They're in a context I don't know well, working among people I don't know well, and yet I'm convinced there's things we can learn. And I think Jesus has it kind of gives us some clues of how we can share our faith, which I never do as well as I want. I'm still learning, but I think storytelling is a good tool. I was reminded of a story. It takes place right after Jesus's death and burial, and his disciples. Mary, he reveals himself to Mary on Sunday morning. That same Sunday, our story happens. Two of his disciples are on the road to Emmaus, and we're going to pick up the story there. It's a true story. It comes from God's word. It goes like this. Now, as they were walking, they were talking and discussing about all the things that had happened. And it was that Jesus himself drew near and began to walk with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus asked them, "What are these things you're discussing as you walk on the road?" And they stood still, and their faces were downcast. I'm going to stop the story there, although it continues on, and eventually Jesus does reveal himself to them. But I'm intrigued by several things. Did you catch it? What are the two disciples doing? As they're walking along, what are they doing? They're talking and discussing about all the things that had happened. And who joins them? Jesus. And begins to walk with them. And yet, what's the issue? What's the catch? Did you catch it? Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So Jesus is walking along with them, and he asks a question. Did you hear it? What are these things you are what? What are these things you are discussing as you walk along the way, as you walk along the road? And they stopped, and then we're told their emotion. Did you catch it? What were they feeling? They were sad. I'm intrigued by this story at so many levels, but I just want to see what we can pick out. Notice, what do we find out about Jesus? Jesus joins the disciples. And Jesus has choices. So he comes up to them. He could have kind of clamored for their attention. "Hey guys, it's me." He could have kind of inserted himself and say, "Hey, I'm here." um, Kind of dominated, the moment, or kind of overwhelmed them. Maybe he could have chosen to do that. But what does he choose to do? You got two guys that have experienced a lot in just the last few days, and they're trying to process all that's going on. And what does Jesus do? He joins the conversation. He just comes alongside, begins to walk with them. And then notice this. Did you catch it? He asks a question. So he uses questions to kind of enter in to not what he wants to talk about, but what they're already discussing. So Jesus joins them where they're at, and then he uses questions to enter into their conversations. What do we learn about Jesus' heart in that? What does that tell us about Jesus? I don't know. I'm intrigued by what comes to my mind. There's a certain humility. If there was any a time when it would have been probably appropriate, or we could kind of excuse kind of a certain bravado, aha, that would have been it. But you don't see that in Jesus. If anything, you see a respect for these guys who are trying to process everything that's going on, a gentleness with them. There's no kind of finger poking. There's a certain sense in which he's wanting to enter in and honor not only where they're at, but how they're processing things already. Now, who's he talking to? He's talking to two disciples. So it's two disciples who are grieving all that's happened to Jesus. Jesus shows up in the midst of their conversation on their walk, and what? They don't recognize him. So these are two men that don't recognize Jesus. Let me say that again. These are two followers of Jesus that don't recognize Jesus. And I just want to ask us, does it happen today that people get caught up in conversation, even conversation about Jesus, and they fail to recognize him? Sure. And yet, does it happen today that Jesus wants to come alongside people that are dealing with things they don't know how to process. And he wants to help. He wants to enter into their conversation by asking questions. Sure, I think so. I don't think it's a story of exceptions. I think it's a story that's providing some examples, not only of the disciples, but also of Jesus. So I'm curious today, what conversations do you have planned? What conversations have you already found yourself in? Could it be maybe we would need to make different choices than those disciples? Maybe we need to ask God, would you give us eyes and ears to see, where is Jesus right here at my elbow in this conversation? And how could I invite him to participate in our discussion? That right there, friends, is what I'm suggesting is a 5-minute story. I'm watching the clock. It actually was closer to 6 minutes, so I cheated. But the point of what I'm trying to do here in this exercise is to try and suggest there are ways to engage people using stories. And I think Jesus is modeling that for us here. One, he's with people. He's walking where they're walking, both physically and literally metaphorically. Emotionally, it's interesting. Jesus honors their emotions here and kind of makes space for them. But then notice what else he does is he asks questions. I wonder if that's some of what God's inviting us to do, is how do we walk where people are walking, spending time where they're spending time? And then how do we kind of enter into their conversations? I find to be very hard. I always enjoy just talking about me. But how do we learn to ask questions and get them talking about what they want to talk about? And then look for bridges, look for ways to bring in. And we're not trying to be utilitarian, but we're trying to be open. Later in the gospel story, the Emmaus Road story, Jesus rebukes them for their lack of faith. So there is an element in which there's corrections necessary, but he doesn't ever start there. And I wonder if that's a good model for us. So a couple of things that I just want to throw out there. One, you're going to feel more comfortable telling stories or using your stories to engage people if you know your stories. So find a story or have a catch of stories that you practice regularly, that you know well, you've shared with friends at church, with your kids. That's going to make it easier so that when a bridge comes to mind and you're like, oh, that reminds me of a story, you know that story. Two, you don't have to share all of the story, particularly if you're in a close, time is short, or you don't have a lot of, there's not a lot of space, whether relationally or time-wise. You don't have to share the whole story. I didn't share the whole 20-verse story from Emmaus Road. I just shared a couple of, 3 verses. Perfect, great, just use that. But then notice I tried to repeat, I told it, and then I basically retold it. And I kind of used rhetorical. Okay, so what did he say? Did you catch it? I use that little phrase. I like that. Did you catch it? It's kind of an excuse to kind of, well, yeah, but what did you mean? Okay, just kind of, you're engaging them. You tell the story, then you kind of retell it and possibly ask them to kind of finish a sentence or two. What we in the storytelling process we call it doing a lead through, but you're kind of doing an abbreviated one. And then you're asking just a couple of simple questions. I love the choice question. We saw Jesus doing this. What other choices did he have? We see the disciples doing this. What other choices did they have? They could have walked by Jesus. They could have not engaged Jesus in conversation. We didn't get all of that. Some of that's hypothetical, but it gets us thinking and trying to kind of make those help us better understand. And then we're kind of saying, oh, what about today? How does this happen? You kind of summarize a couple of the points that have stood out. So again, those are just ways to try and draw in. What about today? What about you and me? So again, you're applying it. So all of that is us kind of trying to move through the story in an abbreviated sort of way. It's not magic. And they may cut you off, which is always painful. You may get interrupted, the bus comes, or they have to get off at the next stop, whatever. That's okay. That's okay. But I do think that there's something in those short, abbreviated engagements that we can see Jesus is drawing near, asking questions, and then pointing people, providing interpretation. And I love that. And Jesus does say that. At the end of that passage there in Luke 24, oh you foolish ones, slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have said. Did not the Christ must suffer these things and enter into his glory? And then beginning from that passage, beginning from there, he interpreted to them all the law of Moses and the prophets concerning himself. And I wonder if in some ways that's our role. For so many people, they never heard the name Jesus, so they don't have any interpretation of him. Other people, even worse maybe, they've heard of Jesus, but they have a skewed perspective on him. They need a fresh interpretation of Jesus. And I wonder if sometimes sharing Bible stories gives people some of the raw material so that they can actually, they're not hearing about him, they're actually hearing the stories that he told. It's like, this isn't my perspective, this is God's perspective on who Jesus is. This is Jesus' perspective on who God is. That excites me. And I wonder if we do, part of telling stories is trying to give people the materials so that they can have a fresh interpretation on who God is, as revealed in Jesus. So I just share that with you. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think looking for those opportunities and then asking the Spirit, where would you want me to bring in your word? And there may be times he says, just be quiet. But there may be times when he says, oh, here, oh, there's a bridge. And you and I are going to get it right sometimes. We're going to miss it sometimes. That's okay. But God, I think, is open. I think God's looking for people who are open to saying, I'm willing if you'll nudge me, if you'll show me how. Give me the question to ask and then help me find a bridge where I can bring your word in at some level. So I think what you guys are doing is incredibly significant. So take heart. I think as we walk with people and ask questions, tell stories, I think we're like Jesus. Thanks for listening.